without much further ado, if I may, I would just like to ask to take you through a journey, and we will start in Latin America, since it's morning for them and they are very fresh with their coffees and teas. And I would like to introduce Dr. Marcia Vera Espinoza, I hope I've pronounced it correctly, and she is a lecturer in human geography at Queen Mary University of London. Her research in development, political, and social geography has a focus on migration in Latin America. And she, in her studies, she's particularly interested in looking at migration and refugee dynamics, and also understanding, experiences of inclusion as well as migration governance in Latin America. Before she joined Queen Mary University, she was an associate researcher within the European Research Council funded project that looked at prospects for international migration governance, and she taught at the University of Sheffield. She's currently conducting a study on the impacts of COVID on migrant and refugee populations across 7 countries in Latin America, as part of this research group that looks at sort of a comparative analysis on international migration and displacement in the Americas. So it's a wider study, and her study focuses particularly on Latin America. And I'm excited to say that we are a privileged audience, as we will hear some of the preliminary findings and reflections from this ongoing research across 7 Latin American countries. And then she will really zoom on the institutional responses and the role of key actors. So please have your pens, or is it keypads ready to shoot down all those questions that you have been storing up with regard to migration management in Latin America. Dr. Marcia, if I just invite you to give your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Patty, and thank you everybody for joining us today, wherever you are. I would like to thank as well the colleagues of the Global Research Forum on Diaspora and Transnationalism for the invitation and for organizing this cross-regional dialogue. It's really exciting to present alongside colleagues analyzing the impacts of COVID-19 and migrant and refugee populations across Latin America, Africa, and Asia. Really a welcome dialogue. So I'm very happy to be with you today here. Today, we'd like to share, as Patty mentioned, some initial findings from the ongoing research that we are conducting with colleagues across 7 institutions in Latin America as part of our research group, CAMINAR, which is Comparative Analysis on International Migration and Displacement in the Americas. And as part of this project, we are exploring the impacts of COVID-19 in migrant refugee population in Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, Chile, Brazil, Uruguay, and Mexico. So we're speaking in particular about these findings, but I know that my colleague Leisa Brumat, that also is a specialist in the region, will allow us to contextualize this as well in different ways. So you will see a lot of crossovers between mine and Leisa's presentation as we also work along together in many projects as well. Now, to put a little bit in context, when we think about the crisis of COVID-19, this crisis hit Latin America in the midst of 2 major displacement crises. So we have on one hand that over 5 million Venezuelan citizens have been forced to migrate mainly to other South American destinations over the past 5 years. Mexico, on the other hand, has been grappling with the transmigration and increasing settlement of hundreds of thousands of Central American migrants as a result of the externalization of border and asylum procedures by the United States. Suddenly, what we had is that these key countries of the region turned from being sending into transit, but mainly destination countries. In the context of raising xenophobia and limited state capacity, migrants and refugees have been excluded from most of the emergency responses to the COVID-19, particularly those ones that are in irregular situation, either structurally or in practice. Indeed, a review authored by our research team concluded that the COVID-19 crisis has deepened the vulnerabilities faced by this displaced population, for which there has been very little in the form of targeted interventions by the different governments in the region. Now, as part of our research, so far since the beginning of May, we have conducted 70 interviews with officials of national and local governments in the main cities and transit cities across these 7 countries. We also interview NGOs, migrant-led organizations, and also international organizations. All key informants have confirmed that the COVID-19 indeed has increased and exacerbated some conditions of precarity or vulnerability of the mobile population in Latin America, given the high rates of job informality and job insecurity, overcrowded living conditions, and in some cases, limited access to health service and social protection, which varies across the region. These multiple determinants of vulnerability, mediated by the intersectionality of age, sex, and also race, means that the migrant and refugee populations are not only more vulnerable to the risk associated with the COVID-19 virus, but that the different levels of inclusion in governmental responses to the crisis have also deepened pre-existing inequalities and gaps between the migrant and the national populations. So then what we have in Latin America is a double crisis, one of the increasing displacement flows, not only of Venezuelan and Central Americans, but also of Haitians and Colombian, among other groups. But also we have the one of the COVID-19 sanitary crisis. Latin American historic social and economic inequality and high rates of labor informality poses an extra layer of complexity to the government's ability to effectively deal with the crisis within the crisis. I would like to briefly outline here 5 initial ideas that emerged from our research and that can contribute to this debate. One is the one of mobility within immobility. The pandemic, as in many regions across the world, is reshaping already changing mobility dynamics and producing new migration patterns with attendant drivers and consequences, what we call a sort of mobility in immobility. In particular, the unprecedented context of border restriction and pandemic migration measures have provoked 2 distinctive movements, one the return and the other one of forced immobility. On the one hand, the exacerbation of migrants' already precarious living conditions have led to many to take the extraordinary bottom-up actions to guarantee their livelihoods, leading to mass returns, many of them by foot, to their countries of origin or emigrate to other places, either nationally or internationally. On the other hand, the region has witnessed reinforced patterns of involuntary and forced immobility that is propitiated by top-down measures, such as the increased express deportations, often without due process, and by the limitations on cross-border movements and the ability to seek international protection imposed by border closures. Examples abound. Bolivian and Peruvian migrants, for example, labor migrants. In Chile, they were some of the first ones to start their journey back to their countries when the lockdown measures started. Unable to return home because of the border closures, they stay in the border cities in the case of Chile, which represented a new risk because there was a lot of people congregating together outside the consulates looking for an opportunity to move back to their countries. But then on the other hand, we have the situation, what is happening in the case of Central American migrants, that through the migrant protection protocols known as the Remain in Mexico program, the agreement that enables the United States to send non-Mexican asylum seekers back to Mexico to wait for the immigration proceedings, is also having very dire consequences. Due to the current suspension of the program, more than 15,000 asylum seekers, mostly from Central America, are trapped in 11 border cities in Mexico. So basically, increasingly, Mexico is becoming a destination country as well. Second point, the pandemic has emphasized, and this is quite important when we're looking at responses, the key role that the local has within migration governance. In many countries in Latin America, across the 7 countries that we are researching, we can see that the municipalities are the ones that have better responded to the needs of migrant and refugee populations, as they have prepared shelter accommodations for those groups that they were trying to go back home, that they are provide food parcels to the ones that are in dire situation because of the pandemic, and they also have included migrant and refugee population into their own social programs by also liaising directly with the NGOs and migrant organizations. So really the municipalities are the ones that we have to emphasize here. Third, through our interview, we have explored some of the consequences of border closures in the short and long term. For example, of how they change the migration procedures in these countries. For example, one of the trends that we have seen is the sudden and accelerated digitalization of migration procedures, as is the case of Chile, Peru, and Uruguay, in order to avoid people going to process their visas or documentation to the main offices. While some of these developments are welcome in terms of digitalization, there's still a lack of evaluation of how it's working so far. Initial assessments provided by civil society and migrant organizations through our research claim that the digitalization of procedures hasn't reduced waiting times. In many cases, have extended and prolonged the waiting times. That not all procedures are included, and also that in many cases, there are not alternatives measures taken when there is a lack of digital literacy or there's people that doesn't have access to internet data. There are some welcome developments in relation to, for example, some temporal extensions to the expired day of certain IDs or visa documents, as been the case of Peru, Colombia, or Chile, for example. However, we see a worsened situation when we talk about asylum. And this is because most of asylum procedures in Latin America, as many countries in the world, require an initial interview. And because there's a lack of face-to-face contact, those interviews in many cases are not taking place, which means that thousands of people across the region are being unable to claim asylum or are right now in an irregular situation. What is clear, as some of our interviewees have said, more border restrictions don't stop migration, but instead increase migrant irregularity. The mobility going in and out of the countries of the region continues, as many opt to, at last resort, to use unauthorized border crossings. 4th point, many NGOs, migrant-led organizations, and international organizations have to quickly react and redirection their own budgets and plans to make, be able to confront the crisis. So they had to adapt their plan and programs quite quickly. Not only international organizations, we see this in the case of the UNHCR, the IOM, but we see it as well in the case of NGOs and migrant-led organizations. They have to work with each other as well as with local governments in order to provide food parcels, food vouchers, to create some cash-in-hand interventions to cover these increasing needs. There's questions that emerge here about the role of these organizations and how permanent this sense of emergency is going to be. My 5th and last point to bring to this conversation. In many of the countries we analyze, there has been reports of increasing xenophobia and discrimination against migrants as governments, in many cases, the media, and society at large tend to relate COVID-19 and associate COVID-19 with irregular migration. We can see an increasing campaign in this regard, even when in many cases it wasn't irregular migration the one that brought to the virus in the first place. Despite this difficult regional scenario, we also have seen some specific acts of solidarity among host and migrant communities. Even what is more relevant, and here when we're talking about good practices, is also emphasize the good actors, as being the support and the role in Latin America of migrant-led organizations. No pro-migrant organization, actually migrant-led organizations that with limited budget and limited human capital have done enormous efforts to cover basic needs when they can, but also to continue with the awareness campaign and to make sure to keep migrant communities informed about the changing sanitary measures by translating information in different languages through the social media and WhatsApp campaigns or different formats. Now, beyond these initial 5 points remains the question of how COVID-19 is changing migration dynamics in Latin America and the experiences of migrants and refugees, but also how migration governance is changing in the region. Governments across the region have overwhelmingly responded to the displacement fluxes of the last 5 years as temporal contingency, adopting a series of ad hoc measures that reinforce displacement as an emergency issue. The emergency response to COVID-19 then reinforces and pushes to think about this idea of the crisis within the crisis. As we have to think how we move forward from the emergency, particularly we have to be thinking about how this response of the emergency within the emergency is changing the prospects of inclusion and integration in Latin America. As we know, migrants have been an key to the efforts to mitigate the virus, and they will also be key in the recovery process. including them now in the government responses, as well as including all these other key actors that are emerging, will facilitate these efforts, but also will contribute to reduce the gaps between migrant and native populations now, but also in the post-pandemic. And I will leave it there. Thank you, Patty.
Dr. Marcia, we can listen to you all day because I think that there's so much to unpack in that study covering those 7 countries, but I think also understanding a bit more of what's happening at the regional level. I like the part where you really bring out the fact that migrant-led organizations have really been in the forefront. I think this is something that other regions, other governments can pick up in terms of leveraging support. But I think it also ties in very well with the presentation of our next speaker in seeing how migrant-led organizations are able and also looking at how there's solidarity among host communities, even dealing with things like increased xenophobia and how they react to it, pertaining to how state authorities react to it. So